You believed Europe protected your money until it erased it overnight and called it progress. You accepted obedience as safety. If this feels uncomfortable, stay. Chapter 1. The day your currency stopped belonging to you. On January 1st, 1999, Europe did not create a new currency. It erased many old ones. Marks, francs, lira, pesetas, identities that had survived wars, revolutions, and empires were dissolved with signatures, spreadsheets, and applause. You were told this was unity, stability, progress. But psychologically, it was submission disguised as evolution. You believed money was yours because you earned it, because you held it, because it carried your nation's face. That belief was the weakness. Ownership was never physical, it was conditional, and that condition was quietly revoked. No tanks crossed borders, no flags fell, no speeches warned you. The transition was clean, polite, technical. That is how real power prefers to move, not through fear, but through paperwork. The euro did not arrive as a currency. It arrived as a command. Trust the system more than yourself. Trust institutions more than history. Trust promises more than precedent. And you complied because resistance would have required understanding. You were not robbed, you were reorganized. From that moment forward, your savings were no longer anchored to your country's discipline, culture, or political responsibility. They were tied to a structure you could not influence, a consensus you could not exit, and a mechanism you were never trained to question. This chapter is not about economics. It is about psychological relocation. Your identity was moved without your consent. Your reference points were replaced. Your currency stopped being a reflection of your nation and became a symbol of obedience to a collective design. The dangerous part is not that Europe changed its money. The dangerous part is that you were grateful. You celebrated the removal of your leverage because it was framed as belonging. You confused inclusion with protection. And in doing so, you accepted a future where stability belonged only to those who designed the system, not those who lived inside it. This was not the beginning of collapse. It was the end of innocence. Chapter 2. The mechanism that turned unity into dependence. The euro was sold as a bridge between nations. In reality, it was a lever. A single currency without a single government is not cooperation. It is controlled imbalance. Before 1999, each country could fail privately. After 1999, every failure became collective, but not every country paid the same price. Strong economies gained discipline. Weak economies lost oxygen. The system did not remove risk. It redistributed who was allowed to survive it. You were told that shared money would force responsibility. The truth is colder. Shared money removes escape. Once inside, you could no longer devalue independently, stimulate freely, or protect your own industries. Your economy became a patient whose medication was chosen by a committee that did not feel your pain. This is the core psychological mechanism. When you remove individual consequence, you concentrate individual power. Germany gained stability. Southern Europe gained dependency. Banks gained insulation. Citizens gained silence. You believed interest rates were technical. They were political weapons. You believed debt limits were economic. They were behavioral cages. You believed convergence would raise everyone. It only separated those who designed the rules from those who had to live under them. The euro did not unify behavior. It standardized obedience. And here's the trap. Once your survival depends on the system, you defend the system, even when it harms you. Criticism becomes betrayal. Exit becomes madness. Doubt becomes isolation. This is how control matures, not through force, but through dependency that feels voluntary. You were no longer competing as nations. You were competing for tolerance from institutions that never needed your loyalty, only your compliance. The currency did not fail Europe. It taught Europe who was replaceable. And it taught you something more dangerous, that stability is worth more than sovereignty. That predictability is safer than control. That submission is acceptable when it arrives wearing the language of progress. You did not lose money first. You lost the ability to imagine living without the structure that now owns it. Chapter 3. The roles inside the machine. Every system creates species, not citizens, not equals, species. Inside the euro structure, four emerged. First, the architects, central bankers, regulators, and institutional designers. They do not argue ideology. They manage probability. Their loyalty is not to nations, but to system survival. They never lose, personally. When failure happens, it is called adjustment. Second, the beneficiaries. Export giants, financial institutions, political elites. They speak in moral language while operating in arithmetic. For them, the euro was not unity. It was leverage. A fixed battlefield where their advantages could no longer be challenged by currency shifts. Third, the performers, politicians who promised growth while managing decline. Their role was translation, to turn constraint into narrative. to sell inevitability as responsibility. They did not govern outcomes. They governed perception. And finally, the bearers. Workers, savers, small producers. The ones who absorbed every invisible correction, inflation without raises, taxes without growth, stability without security. They were told they were part of something larger. They were never told they were the collateral. Here is the psychological pattern. The architects design, the beneficiaries extract, the performers distract, the bearers endure. And the system survives because each group believes it is temporary. The performers think they will become beneficiaries. The bearers think loyalty will protect them. The beneficiaries think insulation is permanent. The architects know none of this is true. This is how hierarchy sustains itself, not through cruelty, but through hope placed in the wrong direction. You were taught to see Europe as a family. Families do not assign interest rates to pain. Systems do. And once you understand this, you see the real division is not North versus South, rich versus poor, creditor versus debtor. It is designers versus participants, predators versus occupants, those who move the board versus those who live on it. You were not meant to win inside this structure. You were meant to remain functional. Chapter 4. Why collapse was not an accident. You were told Europe stumbled into crisis, that it was miscalculation, bad luck, poor timing. You were given weather, not engineering. But systems of this size do not fail randomly. They fail directionally. The euro removed currency as a pressure valve. Before 1999, weak economies could devalue and recover quietly. After 1999, they were forced to bleed publicly. Every imbalance became permanent. Every mistake became structural. The system did not correct behavior, it preserved hierarchy. This is the first law of large power systems. Stability is never neutral. It always protects the strongest position. Germany gained a currency weaker than its productivity. Southern Europe inherited a currency stronger than its economy. One side exported, the other borrowed. Both were told this was cooperation. Debt became obedience with better branding. And here is the deeper mechanism. Once a nation cannot control its money, it must control its people instead, through austerity, through compliance, through narrative discipline. You watched countries lose hospitals, pensions, futures, while being praised for responsibility. That is not economic management. That is behavioral conditioning. History has done this before. Empires do not conquer with armies anymore. They integrate with systems. Rome used roads. Britain used trade. Europe used currency. And every time the language is the same: stability, order, unity, necessity. But here is the predator truth. A system that cannot be exited is not a partnership. It is a containment structure. You were not invited into a union. You were absorbed into a mechanism. And once absorbed, resistance becomes irrational, protest becomes irresponsible, survival becomes selfish. This is how control modernizes. No chains, no flags, only spreadsheets that decide who may breathe easier. The euro did not fail Europe. It revealed what Europe was willing to accept in exchange for calm. And once you see that, you stop asking why collapse happened. You start asking who collapse was useful for. Chapter 5. Silence as leverage. You were taught that resistance is loud, that power announces itself, that influence explains. That is why you keep losing. Inside systems like the euro, movement is not achieved by opposition. It is achieved by positioning. Those who survive do not shout. They relocate weight. They shift dependency. They make themselves expensive to ignore. Observe the states that adapted fastest. They did not protest the structure. They learned how to sit inside it with advantage. They controlled logistics. They dominated regulation. They mastered narrative. They became responsible leaders while extracting quietly. This is how predators evolve inside cages. They stop hitting the bars and start owning the feeding schedule. You were trained to moralize, to demand fairness, to call out imbalance. But systems do not respond to fairness. They respond to utility. If you are useful, you are protected. If you are replaceable, you are corrected. The euro taught this lesson brutally. Nations that begged were punished. Nations that negotiated silently were rewarded. There is no heroism in being right inside a system designed to ignore you. There is only positioning. This is the shift you were never allowed to make. From participant to variable, you do not argue with the machine. You become a component it cannot afford to remove. That requires restraint. It requires opacity. It requires abandoning the need to be understood. Because in hierarchical systems, visibility is exposure, and exposure invites correction. The euro did not teach Europe how to cooperate. It taught the survivors how to disappear into influence. And this is the uncomfortable part. The most powerful actors inside the system do not look powerful. They look compliant, calm, responsible, predictable. They are none of those things. They are simply quiet, and silence inside a controlled structure is not weakness, it is leverage. Chapter 6. The Death of the Obedient Self. The version of you that trusted systems was designed for stability, not survival. It believed loyalty created safety. It believed participation earned protection. It believed compliance was maturity. That identity was not naive, it was engineered. Because systems do not collapse by force, they are abandoned by those who stop believing in the role they were assigned. When Europe deleted its money, it did more than change currency. It erased emotional ownership. Citizens no longer held something that belonged to them. They held a unit that belonged to a structure. And quietly, without ceremony, the obedient self became obsolete. The obedient self needs permission. The obedient self needs validation. The obedient self needs to be seen as moral. The sovereign self does not. The sovereign self understands that legitimacy is borrowed, not owned. That stability is rented. That loyalty is temporary. This is not cynicism, it is clarity. The obedient self asks, is this allowed? The sovereign self asks, who benefits if I obey? The obedient self wants approval. The sovereign self wants position. This chapter does not ask you to rebel. Rebellion is predictable. It asks you to withdraw identity from systems that do not protect it. You stop defining yourself by compliance. You stop explaining your restraint. You stop advertising your loyalty, not because you are hostile, but because you are no longer available for emotional taxation. The euro taught Europe how to share currency. It taught survivors how to separate identity from currency. That is the real shift. You are not a citizen inside the structure. You are a strategist inside a hierarchy. And the moment you stop seeing yourself as belonging to the system loses its psychological hold over you. This is not empowerment. This is replacement. The obedient version of you is finished. What replaces it is quieter, colder, and far harder to control. Chapter 7. The Line You Were Never Meant to Cross. Most people will stop here, not because they disagree, but because recognition is more painful than ignorance. They will call this perspective cold. They will call it arrogant. They will call it dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it dissolves the comfort of belonging. Europe did not lose money in 1999. It lost the illusion that ownership was permanent. From that moment forward, currency became permission, stability became negotiation, citizenship became conditional, and the public accepted it because most humans do not protect sovereignty, they protect familiarity. You now stand in the small space between awareness and choice. You can return to the crowd and call this insight interesting, or you can accept what it quietly demands, responsibility for your own position. The system does not fear rebels. It fears observers who no longer need approval. It fears those who do not protest but reposition, who do not attack but withdraw leverage, who do not beg but calculate. The euro was not a currency experiment, it was a loyalty experiment, and most failed it without ever realizing they were tested. You are not here to fix systems. You are here to survive inside them without surrendering identity. You are not here to convince others. You are here to see what others refuse to see. From this point forward, you will recognize the pattern everywhere, in money, in politics, in relationships, in loyalty, in silence. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This channel is not a community. It is a filter. Most will leave, a few will remain, and those who remain will stop asking for permission to understand power. Subscribe to The Hidden Chapter if you are ready to think where most people refuse to look.